work gets done in organizations in ways that are more effective, more efficient, and safer. And unlike a lot of us, I put myself in that camp, who write about this, sometimes without having data, Jody is probably one of the best researchers in the world who shows this. And she shows it with her data in lots of different industries. She's been an absolute game changer in how we think about the importance of positive interrelating in explaining excellence and performance. And her core idea, and it's really her core idea, and research on the idea of relational coordination is literally transforming healthcare around the globe. I'm such a deep admirer not only of her research, but also the way she creates communities of scholars and practitioners who learn and make change happen together. I strongly suggest that you look at her Relational Coordination Research Collaborative. If you Google her name, you can find her collaborative, which brings together scholars and practitioners to help build relational coordination for high performance. And it's one of those websites that has a ton of downloadable, really good stuff. So one of you asked a question when you signed up about where you find more information. That's where you need to go. It's a very wonderful website. She also co-founded a university spinoff called Relational Coordination Analytics that offers measurement and intervention support to organizations that are seeking to improve their performance. And she serves as their chief scientific officer of that organization. She's written lots of scholarly articles and some very important books that have shown the power of relational coordination in both airlines and healthcare. For example, I teach with the book The Southwest Way, Using the Power of Relationships to Achieve High Performance. She also has a book, High Performance Healthcare, Using the Power of Relationships to Achieve Quality, Efficiency, and Resilience. And I was also privileged to read an early version of her new book that's coming out called Transforming Relationships for High Performance, which offers a dynamic, multi-interventional model of change. So what I love about this most recent book is it's not just showing the relationship between relational coordination and performance, but it's talking very usefully about how you actually do it. Today she's going to talk about transforming relationships for high performance, the power of relational coordination, and let's give her a Go Blue welcome.
Thank you so much, Jane. It is an honor to be here among so many respected colleagues and those I haven't met yet. And I have to say that Jane is one of my heroes in academia and beyond. So I really am thrilled to be among you today. Thank you so much. So Jane mentioned the Relational Coordination Research Collaborative. I happen to have a picture of it here, of the website here, but this is a research group that I have been leading lately, and it's based at Brandeis University, and we have colleagues around the world who are working with us to transform relationships for high performance. And what we have come to see performance in this more multi-dimensional way to include things like thriving, as Jane was talking about. But I think the context that I like to set is something I've noticed as I travel around and speak to organizations, whether it's in healthcare or other industries, and that is, it's a very challenging time to be leading an organization or working on the front line. It's just, it's a difficult time. There's a lot of pressure to achieve better outcomes and to do it with fewer resources, and at the same time engage employees and have them really be part of the leadership of the organization. And the question is this even possible? How do you do more with less? And is that really an unrealistic thing to ask? I know one time giving a talk in New York City, one of the nursing leaders raised her hand and said, in my experience, you don't do more with less, you do less with less. And certainly that other things equal, that would seem to be true. So today we'll talk about what is this concept of relational coordination, how does it drive performance, and what aspects of performance is it helping to drive? How does it currently work in the organizations that you're familiar with? I'd really invite you to reflect on that as we move through
this hour, and what have we learned about how organizations can support it or unintentionally undermine it. That's been a big part of the work too, not just how does it drive performance, but what's the organizational context that is most conducive to its development, and then where to start. That's really the new work that Jane referenced, and it's about the change process, and I'll share 3 stories, ongoing live kind of case studies of organizations engaged in this process of really transforming the way people relate to each other to achieve outcomes for their customers. And here's a little peek at the 2 books that Jane referenced, because it really shows, I think, graphically where this work has begun. It started first in the flight departure process when I was a doctoral student many moons ago at MIT, and then has moved into this healthcare arena where it's been a pretty receptive audience, in part because the stakes are so high for healthcare. We're really transforming, or hoping to transform in a very fundamental way, what we even mean by that. And I think the very last case today will give a peek into where I think that the potential is for that to go. So this is where I started, watching flight departures. I was a student in Boston, so I was at Logan Airport, and I had access to originally American Airlines through a committee member who happened to be on the board, and said, go in and you can interview people. And one interview, research itself is a highly relational process, as Jane has written about, and one interview turned into the next, into the next, into the next, and you sort of leverage one until you're studying multiple airlines. And what I did see was that there were many different people, including some we don't see as passengers, involved in this departure process. And when I went to headquarters at American to talk about this with the then Executive Vice President of Operations, Bob Baker, he said, this is the most complicated thing we do every day in many locations, dozens of times a day, and most people don't here at headquarters in Dallas don't even recognize that. So he was kind of giving some insight from the perspective of a person who had started on the ramp, his dad worked on the ramp, et cetera, and now he was top of the operations department at American, that sometimes these really critical things that are going on at the front line remain invisible to top leadership, and it would be helpful to be aware of how critical these dynamics are in order to better support them. So that was one of, I think that introduces up front, even though this is about the front line, the notion that leadership matters, and we'll come back to that later. But what I found as I talked to people at length about what they were doing were things like this. Here you don't communicate. This is someone, a gate agent at American Airlines. Sometimes you end up not knowing things. On the gates, I can't tell you the number of times you get the wrong information from ops. The hardest thing at the gate when flights are delayed is to get information. And as I was doing some of these interviews at American, I did hear about an airline I'd never heard of, Southwest, also based in Dallas, and it took several months, but I got access. And when I started interviewing there, I heard quite different stories. Here, there's constant communication between customer service and the ramp. When planes have to be switched, bags have to be moved, customer service will advise the ramp directly or through ops. Ops keeps everyone informed. It happens smoothly. Well, that's nice. I think I'd rather work there. And then the question, that arose very often is, well, unexpected things will happen. You're working in a very dynamic environment under a lot of time constraints, and you can't control the operating environment. So what is the response? And this is what I heard typically at American. If you ask anyone here what's the last thing you think of when there's a problem, I bet your bottom dollar it's the customer. These are guys who work really hard every day, but they're thinking, how do I stay out of trouble? So that became the kind of problem-solving versus blaming dimension. And what I heard at Southwest was, this was a pilot, we figure out the cause of the delay. We don't necessarily chastise, though sometimes that comes into play. It's a matter of working together, figuring out what we can learn, not finger-pointing. So I started to wonder, well, what's underlying these communication patterns? Because they do seem quite distinct. And these are just example quotations, but there was a consistency I was hearing in these Southwest in Chicago and American in Boston. And so I started to get at some of these deeper issues. And this was a customer service agent. 90% of the ramp employees here don't care what happens, even if the walls fall down, as long as they get their check. And then the flight attendants would say the pilots don't really care about this airline. They just want to fly their flights and go out and sail their yachts. And, this kind of sense that we're the only ones that care. And at Southwest, there was a pretty clear sense that people were on the same page with respect to their goals. I would ask, for example, well, what's your job? And often people would say, well, we're here to get you there on time with your bags, safely and happy, preferably. And so there was a sense of that, but one of the I think it was the fuelers said, I've never seen so many people work so hard to do one thing. You see them checking their watches to get the on-time departure. They work real hard. It's over and you're back on time. So the sense of goal alignment. And then knowledge. How much do I was ultimately, as you'll see, I studied American, Southwest, United, and Continental in multiple locations. And I would say that all of these were well-run organizations. They had employees that were well-trained. They really understood their own jobs. The difference was how much did they understand about the jobs of others around them. And so that's really where I saw the difference. I would ask, for example, at American, the ramp employees, well, tell me about your job. Because I would sit in the break rooms. I had plenty of time to hear about it. And it was, when the bell rings, we go out and we offload the bags, we upload the other bags, and we come back here and wait for the next bell. Pretty kind of basic description. But asking the same people at Southwest, well, what's your job, was, a really long story. It's like, well, we're putting the bags on this way because then when you get to the next station, it's easier for them to take them off. And we're putting the information down this way because the pilot needs to know this and they need to know that so the controls can be set properly for takeoff and landing. And basically what we do is really important to everyone. So that kind of shared knowledge, that systems thinking we might want to call it, went beyond the immediate job to the people that we serve. And then this final thing that really had probably the most emotional impact on me was this sense of respect or disrespect that people were feeling. This is a particularly colorful quote, but a lot of similar kind of statements. Employees working here think they're better than other employees. Gate and ticket agents think they're better than the ramp. The ramp think they're better than cabin cleaners. It's a sissy woman's job. Cabin cleaners look down on the building cleaners, and so on. And you would hear these, and this doesn't even take into account the pilots and the flight attendants. This is just here talking about the people working on the ground. And probably the most dramatic difference was in this respect with Southwest interviews. No one takes the job of another person for granted here. SkyCap is just as critical as the pilot. You can always count on the next guy standing there. No one department is any more important than another. So those dimensions together led me to believe that, at least as a hypothesis, that relationships were actually shaping the communication through which coordination was occurring. So that coordination was not this kind of mechanical process, but actually driven by some really critical relationships. And it was happening sometimes in this fairly positive, mutually reinforcing cycle, what we might call a positive spiral of people understanding how their goals were aligned and how each was contributing a certain critical piece of it, and that they felt respect for their work. And that was supporting or reinforcing sufficiently frequent, timely, accurate problem-solving communication. But often there was more of this negative dynamic where people were focused on their functional goal without the benefit of a systems thinking, what Herb Simon called sub-goal optimization, where you're optimizing the local goal to the point where you might actually miss the real goal, but maybe that's the reward structure, as we'll see. And specialized knowledge without the benefit of seeing how what you do connects to those around you, and a sense that your work may not be understood or respected. And that, I suspected, would account for insufficiently frequent, often delayed communication. How can you know who needs to know what and why and when if you don't respect their work, don't understand their work, and so on? Inaccurate. It's hard to frame something in a way that people will get if you don't really understand how they're thinking. And when things go wrong, recourse to finger pointing rather than problem solving, in part because if you know you did your job correctly, and other people, it has to be someone else who caused the problem, as opposed to being attentive to what happened in between that may not be on the screen. So I called that relational coordination because when I called it cross-functional coordination, people said that's not usually what people mean by coordination, but I simply defined it as communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. And I think it was someone from the PAS movement who was reviewing a paper I was writing, who got me to finally define what this really is. And I think written a little bit more broadly, it's mutually reinforcing process of communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. So I really wanted to know, does this matter for performance? And so I had to find a way to measure this. And it turns out that, I knew enough about networks that I wanted to measure it as a set of networks between each of those groups. Do you share my goals? Do you understand my work? Do you respect my work? Is your communication with me sufficiently frequent, timely, and so on? And so turned it into that kind of measure and found 9 sites across United American Continental and Southwest that I could study over this 12-month period, measured outcomes and did the kind of risk adjustment for obvious differences in the products, which you'll see, and then measured relational coordination across these groups. And these are the survey questions. Each one gets asked with respect to, in this case, there were 12 different functional groups involved. And what I found was that this, even just at this aggregate, this index of relational coordination, predicted shorter gate time per flight. That's the amount of time you have to schedule to park the aircraft at the gate, which is obviously not productive time for either the aircraft or longer gate times mean lower gate utilization. Staff time per passenger. That's basically getting at how productive are our employees. And then on the quality side, what's the impact on customer complaints, lost baggage, and late arrivals? And looking at it in a graphical form, when we put together the performance outcomes into an index and RC, seeing that, and a scatter plot, seeing that these different sites varied quite significantly in both their relational coordination and their performance outcomes. And, what's interesting is that even within a given organization like Southwest, this was their Chicago site up there, this was their LA site. They had asked if I could include what they thought was their best performing and their worst performing site at the time. And so you can see, as we know with organizations, you can have areas of excellence and other areas that are more challenged, and how can you learn across that? I think is one of the interesting questions. But as I started to share those results with people, I would hear things like, well, isn't Southwest just this, cute little airline in Texas, and what can we really learn from them? They're not, at that time, we're not seen to be a serious national player. And besides, people just wanted to know if this was just a Southwest thing or if it's something that might go beyond that. And I thought, well, I think it may be a pretty fundamental organizational dynamic. I was in the hospital having a baby and started to think, well, maybe this is something that actually might, right in the middle of the dissertation, and my care process wasn't this complex, but it did make me very curious because there's a lot of coordination that's happening. And I was pretty impressed. The nurses would, one would come in and say, I know you've already heard this, but and this was after Rose came out, but I know you've already heard this, but let me build on that. And the next person would come in, and they just felt like they were in a continuous conversation, like they really were on the same page. And I said, your coordination is great. Have you been working on this? And they said, yeah, we've been doing TQM. It's going great. And I said, well, at one point I said, well, when's my doctor coming? Oh, we don't know. They don't tell us anything. So it really it kind of mirrored what I'd seen in the airline study, where the ties were typically pretty strong within the group, and then they got weaker between. And for reasons that you can imagine. It's not just occupational identity and so on, but the various structures that we put in place that tend to reinforce a siloed thinking and have focus on our own occupational goals rather than how we fit into the broader process. But we also were hearing at the same time some real thinking at the national level about what's going on with our healthcare system, and it really is not a system. It's kind of a misnomer. Each discipline and a type of organization is defending its own authority at the expense of the total systems functioning, kind of that sub-goal optimization going on like crazy, as we know. And one of my first interviews in this setting was with Dr. Clem Sledge, the chief of orthopedics at Brigham and Women's in Boston. And he was about to retire after a pretty, amazing career, not just chief of orthopedics, but it was heading the physician hospital organization, very well respected. But he had this humble insight that I'll never forget, kind of realizing that there were some areas that they really weren't able to achieve, that he was beginning to see were important. The communication line just wasn't there. We thought it was, but it wasn't. We talk to nurses every day, but we aren't really communicating. I mean, what does that mean? Maybe not listening, but there's something that goes beyond talking. It was not effective communication. And he had come to see that as important and had built it with a nurse manager in his unit, but still saw there was a long way to go. So I did nurses were observing the same problem. This was down the street at Mass General, a clinical nurse specialist. Miscommunication is common because so many things are happening so quickly, but because patients are now in and out so quickly, it's even more important to communicate well. So this was at the time there was starting to be pressure on the length of stay to get patients in and out more quickly, and the paradox of it was that just as it became more important to communicate well so we can be timely in our work, that time constraint also made it hard to communicate well. So it's that kind of double bind that that organizations can find themselves in. And did a very similar study to the airline one in this 9-hospital setting. Decided to focus on joint replacements because they were pretty well documented outcomes, and understood the kind of individual and clinical predictors of the outcome, so I could add this other variable and see what difference it made. And measured these outcomes, and also, of course, the networks of coordination across these key groups. And what I found was that adjusting for these other factors at the patient level primarily, that relational coordination predicted shorter length of stay, greater patient satisfaction, and greater freedom from pain and higher mobility 6 weeks post-op. And this is using, a patient self-assessment tool that was becoming the gold standard at the time for kind of the pre and the post-operative outcomes. And so putting that into the scatter plot again, and these hospitals aren't identified, but they were 4 of them in Boston, 3 in New York City, and 2 in Dallas, and chose them for being, first of all, they had great reputations, and secondly, they had high volumes of joint replacement, so we could get a big enough sample in 6 months. But interesting that the results were similar in the sense of relational coordination accounting for these outcomes. And when I presented this at a University of Newcastle Business School in northern England, a surgeon attended, and he was at the dinner the night before, and he said, I've seen the article in Medical Care, I understand the findings, I believe it, but it's just so different from, what did he say? It's so different from the way we think about our work as surgeons. We think about what's right in front of us right here, and obviously that's important, but not thinking of the broader kind of connections and how that could possibly matter for the clinical outcomes that they are accountable for. So it's, a difference in how the training is, what the training is relative to the reality, interdependence of the work. So this work has been taken more broadly by people other than myself into other sectors, all kinds of healthcare sectors, but also these non-healthcare sectors. And also in very different countries around the world. Just some real variation there that surprises me. And this is not interventional work. This is the basic research of measuring the relational coordination, measuring the outcomes, and seeing what is driving what. And what we're seeing is there is an impact on this set of efficiency and financial outcomes, as well as quality and safety outcomes. Client engagement, it seems somehow easier to work in a partnership way with whether it's the family or the patient or other customer when we are coordinating well as a team. And I just think that's an interesting thing to explore and try to understand. And then I've always taken this for granted, so I didn't used to measure it very much, but people were really interested in how does it affect the well-being of workers themselves. And I think that's why I was interested to begin with. It just seemed obvious. But people have explored it, and I think it's fascinating. And I would love to connect this with things like thriving and people's, but little kind of indications like reduced burnout and increased motivation and equity of contribution, the sense that people are contributing equally what they have to the process. And it reminds me perhaps of the work of Barbara Fredrickson and this idea of broaden and build, and that there's the positive emotions themselves can be conducive to certainly well-being, and even to this next thing, which would be the ability to be creative and to think outside of the box. So people have started to look at what's the impact on learning, psychological safety, innovation, creativity. And so it goes beyond really what I had even considered was interesting, but maybe to just highlight that I've been focusing a lot on operational capacity, but there seems to be this other element that's involved in high-quality relationships, which is adaptive capacity. Ability to, and I think that includes resilience, ability to adapt to the situation in a high-functioning way, and to create solutions that go beyond the immediate what we're already doing. So not just doing what we already do better, but thinking of what we could be doing instead. And another way to look at it, I used to think, and we often think of there being a trade-off between quality and efficiency. And I think what this, the results suggest is that any relational coordination, like other fundamental process improvements, can shift out that production possibilities frontier. So yeah, we may still have a trade-off, but it's at a higher level of outcomes on both dimensions. So we're not just stuck in this either or. And I think that's where the insight is for, well, how could you do more with less? And maybe it's by having more coordinated relationships among ourselves so we're not wasting our efforts in just working at cross purposes. So that's one way to look at it, and there's a working paper, hopefully to be more than a working paper before too long, that tries to pull together all the studies we've found that people are doing. But why? Why would it be? And I guess there are a lot of reasons. One is the kind of the positive psychology and the broaden and the build and the ability to think outside of the box when you are better connected and understand the system in which you're working in a respectful way. But one easy way to say it is it creates an organizational culture that's conducive to learning and process improvement. And that it also helps people to see as coworkers how they connect with each other around the client. Because if you think about it, what's the primary visual that we have of our organizations? In many cases, it's the organization chart. And there you've got the vertical ties, and you can see how managers are connected, but people at the front line are basically only connected up and down. You don't see in there the connections across, the way the work actually flows. So I think what these questions invoke in people and the visuals when we do share them is this, there's another dimension here that really matters that we don't always think about and that may not be reinforced as much as it could be in the HR practices and other kind of organizational structures that hold us accountable for outcomes. So we also have found, not to go too much into this and probably not surprisingly, that the relational coordination matters most for performance under these kinds of conditions. And this kind of draws upon information processing theory when you have high levels of task interdependence, high levels of uncertainty, so you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over. You have to respond to the situation as it emerges and do that in a coordinated way. And when there are time constraints, so you can't just stop and come up with a new plan all the time. There's a kind of adapting and coordinating on the fly that is really critical. And all of these things together, I think, describe complexity, and they're the things that seem to make RC matter more for achieving the desired outcomes. And we can all reflect to what extent are these present in our work. And I think people have argued who've talked about lean manufacturing, for example, that as you try to kind of reduce inventories and produce just in time and so on, you're basically making your organization much more uncertain, more vulnerable to having to adapt to the situation and not know that we have 5 days of inventories that we just work through regardless of what happens. And that happens, I think, in many industries where we're moving more to a just-in-time sort of adapting to the situation model, and that requires that we have higher levels of relational coordination with each other, or else it just burn out and, not good. So we can reflect a little bit, and I'm sure you already are to some extent, on how well it's working in our organizations today. And, for someone who talks about this and tries to support the research and the practice, it's a very high standard to live up to, in our own or even in a small organization. It really requires some attentiveness. And is it, are we acting out this cycle for the most part? And this doesn't mean that we only have one goal. It means we may have a whole balanced scorecard of goals, but we recognize and see that we need to support all of them in some way and support our colleagues who are responsible for things that we're not directly responsible for. Or is it like this? And to the extent that it is, these relationships aren't things that we've created overnight. They're often things that we've inherited and that have been reinforced by the bureaucratic organizational structures that we've inherited. So this really gets me to the question of how do organizations support relational coordination or not? And I've just identified a set of practices. They're things that organizations do every day. How do we select? How do we train people? How do we hold people accountable? And how do we reward for various outcomes? What's the process for resolving conflicts? Is it strictly kind of attentive to vertical conflict across layers, supervisors, employees, or is there a systematic, thoughtful way of resolving and attending to conflicts across peers involved in the same process? And it's surprising how often there's not, and the missed opportunities for growth and learning that come from that. I'm really very fond of Mary Parker Follett, who puts out conflict as a constructive process, but it has to be engaged and not just swept under the rug. So that having that process in place and potentially training to use it, how we design our leader and supervisor roles and boundary spanner roles, people whose job it is to help do the coordination across a team, whether it's a case manager, an ops agent, or a project manager, the design of the jobs themselves. How do we hold team meetings and who is involved, who's invited? Is it inclusive of the right parties? And how do we create protocols that aren't just create clarity about what I'm supposed to do, but create visibility about how what I do connects to what others are doing around me for that same client, like a clinical pathway or something like that. And then how do we even design our information system? So not to go belabor these, but in each of those two initial books, Southwest and the High Performance Healthcare, part 2 is really all about each of those and how much they can vary and how that then shapes the patterns of relational coordination. So the bottom line to that is just that structures can weaken relational coordination, but and often the way we've inherited them, they tend to do that. So we have to be innovative in redesigning those. But they can also support relational coordination, whether we're talking about microstructures that we can just take on at the front line without any permission, or macro structures that we really have to get multiple stakeholders together to say, we really do need to change this. And when you talk about systems of accountability and rewards, it could include Wall Street, your investors, people who really have a stake and want to know how you're doing these things. So those structures can require leadership at various levels to really change them in a productive way. So just to think for a moment about to what extent do we have those structures that still reinforce the silos in ways that are not helpful versus supporting the cross-role relationships where they're critical. And I say cross-role because I think what becomes apparent is we're talking about relationships here that aren't between like Bob and Betty, but they're between roles. So they really are different in that respect. And I was just reflecting before the talk that it first really came home to me when I was interviewing a pilot at BWI Southwest. And we were, just on the jetway there. And I was saying, what do you mean about mutual respect? I mean, and he said, this is what I mean. See the guy coming up for the ramp to give me this information about the weight and balance that I need, for the flight. I don't even know him, but I respect him. And I know he respects me. And so it wasn't about, I've known him forever, of course he respects me, but it had been embedded in the roles. And that's what the well-designed structures can help to do, is really embed this. So you have basically, for those of us who think about high reliability organizations, and that is, related, that you have something that's more reliable than, I know it's going to work fine today because we've got so-and-so here and so-and-so here. You really want it to go beyond that to say, we've got these relationships embedded into our roles so that, not to be unpersonal about it, but impersonal, but if so-and-so has to go and be at a soccer game for her son, or he's got to go somewhere, we know it's still going to work because this is embedded in how we do things here, thanks in part to those structures. So this really takes us to the very most recent work, which is, okay, I just assumed, and in fact, when you do the modeling, and those structures are predictive of the outcomes mediated through those relational dynamics. And so, of course, I thought, well, that's kind of my theory of change, that if you just change those structures, that will change the relational dynamics, and you will get the outcomes that you're looking for. And so people would, I never tested it out, but people would say, well, where would we start? Which one will we do first? And as I started talking to colleagues who do organizational change for their work, they're like, well, structures probably matter, but there's something else going on here. It rarely occurs just by changing the structures. Because you could put in a great structure, like a new information system or a new reward structure, or even to say, we're going to now have a meeting on a regular basis, but people may not know what to do when they get there, or it's just not going to feel like it fits. So these patterns are very deeply ingrained in our cultures of the organization, our professional identity, even our personal identities. They don't just change like that. It's interesting, even when you do a role play, and those of us who, if you've experimented with setting up a role play to teach something, how quickly people grab onto that role in an emotional way, so that as you debrief, there could even be, tears, like, I didn't get that when I needed it. And, these roles, somehow they become, it reminds me maybe of Goffman, but we take them on in a very deep way. And certainly if you can do that in a 1-hour role play, just think about something you've prepared your whole career to do. These don't just change because we have a new structure now. Even if it's, the Affordable Care Act with a whole new reward structure that says you now are sharing accountability for quality and cost outcomes with a larger system. It doesn't just change like that. So the argument that they made was you may need to change relational patterns directly, some kind of culture change that has to happen, and also work process interventions to change the way we do the work, redesign the work. And then, of course, structures matter, but it's not necessarily the one thing that you're doing. So I'll just share 3 stories that help me, just see how organizations are doing this. And the first is Dartmouth-Hitchcock, northern New Hampshire. I live in Portsmouth, and this is a pretty well-known health system in the U.S. and particularly in the East Coast, building an accountable care organization, as I was just referring to. It's what a lot of health systems are trying to do. I'm sure University of Michigan as well, led by their CEO, Jim Weinstein. And of course, this is creating pressure to reduce costs and increase quality throughout the system. And they brought in this, really energetic guy from Tufts Medical School, who was the head of transplant surgery there, to be their chair of surgery. And he said he knew from his work in transplants that it's all about teamwork. Everything has to be timely, and it's when you're on the same page that it really works. And, very energized, and his goal was to take the Department of Surgery from these areas of these traditional silos toward team-based model of care. And as he put it, healthcare reform is driving the imperative for change. We're responding to these reforms by moving from the predominant piece rate system to negotiating contracts in which we'll be paid for the overall cost and quality outcomes of the populations we serve. So he kind of got it at a personal level, but also saw how this was going to be important for responding to the new challenges. And at the same time, this was not an easy thing to do. Another leader in the section, she was the leader of the unit leader of plastic surgery, said morale across the organization is troubled. Within surgery, some of our sections are particularly troubled. For the first time ever, they're having trouble making budgets. Normally, we're the ones who bring in the bulk of the money. We're seen as kind of, pretty special as surgeons in these systems. And now we just feel expensive, right? So talk about identity shift. And then had a few kind of quality issues that they had just been trying to respond to, a few wrong site surgeries and near misses. Despite a checklist and a timeout, the issue was rote completion and there wasn't any communication and feedback. Well, we know checklists are supposed to be attentive to building kind of a sense of shared goals, shared knowledge across a team, but you just kind of impose it as an external structure. It may not be used with that mindfulness. It may be used in a rote way. And that's apparently what happened. So there were 11 participating surgical units. There were some initial kind of really, why are we doing this relational stuff? And then they had a retreat around right before the holidays, and all the section chiefs kind of signed on and said, we're willing to do this. Part of what they would get was this coaching, executive coaching from someone named Eddie Erlandson, who wrote The Alpha Male. You know Eddie? Oh, yeah. So that really, they felt like he really got them. I think he came from Michigan.
He did.
Yes. And he was a surgeon. A vascular, yeah. So that was part of the deal. They would get this executive coaching that would help them become more open to feedback and kind of this 360 that they would have to go through. And Rich Freeman did it first. And that would kind of open them up then to think more about teamwork. And that, I think, was an interesting part of the story in itself. They already saw it really as requiring a different kind of leadership. And Eddie would do that. And at the same time, they decided, and they had coaches who were coming from the Microsystem Academy, Margie Godfrey, Tina Foster, who were going to really support coaches in each of the sections who would then take people through this change process. They decided to start by measuring the RC across all work groups on each unit, from the surgeons to the secretaries, and say, what are our current dynamics? Basically, a 360 for each of the work groups. Do they share my goals? Do they respect my work? Do they understand my work? And so on. And a lot of high response rates. People were engaged, for sure. Scores varied across the units. You had some high and low outliers. And the plan was to feed back the results and share them almost immediately with everyone, so we could look at them not in the nitty-gritty detail that might be too revealing, but to share what people were, the overall patterns. We held this is Margie talking as a Microsystems Institute leader. We held 2 sessions with the coaches and the champions to prepare them to share the RC scores with their sections. So this is really where the RC measure goes from being a research tool to being almost like a mirror that we can hold up to say, what is it like here right now for all of us collectively? Because we each have one little piece of it, but we may not see the whole. It included rehearsals of what they would say. Some of the coaches were surgeons who had a mindset of diagnosis and being prescriptive. So having them practice how they would coach the group was really important. So in a sense here, they're getting, these surgical leaders are getting Eddie Erlandson's kind of 360 feedback from their colleagues, but they're also now learning to be coaches, which is a different leadership style than you typically than you typically have in healthcare, particularly maybe among surgeons. So they had different ways of sharing, how does this look across the 11 sections, but then within each section you could say, okay, so how are we doing between our work groups? How are we doing within the work groups? And you'll see later there you can look at the network map and see where are the weak and strong ties. And it turned out one of the most challenging ones was between surgeons and secretaries, and it was a critical one because there was a lot of coordination happening there for after visit care, and it was a real challenging area. And each section had a kind of a different approach to what they would do. We did group exercises with the data, not just with the improvement team, but with everyone in the section. I developed scenarios based on what I hear people talking about in the halls outside my office. The scenarios were between group, like between physicians and other groups. Some of them were simulations, like here's your RC data, here's your budget data, what would you do? And another one, no, this was actually in the same section, she said the surgeons were really surprised by the RC results. Their ratings of others were pretty high, but the ratings of them were not as high, right? So, and one thing we've seen over time is that when there's a power differential, it tends to be asymmetrical ties. It looks better. It's working better for the higher power group. I also did one-on-ones with all the surgeons to show them what we need from them with the after-visit summaries. Everyone's has improved. So then they started to think about, well, how should they be doing leadership development going forward? If this really is a different way of leading and it requires a different understanding, relationships matter, but it's not just about do I get along with you. It's do I understand your role? Do you understand mine? Is it built into our roles? Care is complex and we need systems thinking. So they started down that path. And to just drop that story for now, and you can ask more about it later if you like, but to go to a very different approach at Billings Clinic out in Montana. This is, again, they're responding to payment reform, seeking to become an ACO. the CEO and actually, in this case, the CEO was quite instrumental up front in deciding not just are we building accountable care, but that teamwork is going to be a critical piece of it. And they started their efforts in the ICU. And why did they choose the ICU? I don't have that here, but the ICU they chose because they were already pretty good at teamwork. And they thought this is a place that they could get even better and then be almost like a positive deviant, something that people could use then to look to and say, oh, that's how you do it. And they could become a kind of a way to demonstrate and disseminate. And what they found was that they asked for each of the doctors to get their own scores because they thought there was going to be some good variation here that they could learn from. And the doctors agreed. And indeed, there were some that were scoring very high and others that weren't. And they started asking, well, what is it that you're doing differently? And in some cases, one of the stories was, well, I've been doing this my whole career, but no one really asked. When a family first comes into the ICU, if there is a family, I take the time to really connect with them because it makes everything else go better after that. Whether even beyond the ICU, they feel like they're heard and they're ready to engage and be part of the process. And the other thing was, I do rounds, and this is how I do the rounds. I make sure everyone speaks up. And so they started learning these things from each other through the fish bowls, basically putting people in the middle of a circle and asking them questions. How do you do this? And even asking nurses, well, why are his rounds better than mine? Well, because blah, blah, blah. And it gave a safe space to learn about how these positive outliers. And even the group that had the lowest scores, the therapists, the speech, language, and respiratory therapists, turned out that they got very energized to then be part of this change process. They did something that initially to me was very embarrassing. I'm like, how can they take my theory and play bingo with it? But they did. They did. And when I first got that email, I'm like, please, can I maybe pretend I didn't see that? But I went out there and they really did get into this. And the idea was this ICU Connections was a group that included all the professions that would meet on occasion, about monthly, and find new ways to work together. And they created a newsletter plus this bingo. So it's to recognize when you see an example of shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect, accurate communication, that you submit cards. And it can't be your own profession. It's got to be someone from a different discipline. So here's some examples. Amber Hellickson, ICU nurse, recognized Dr. Randall, cardiovascular specialist, for shared knowledge. Jen Potts recognized Christy Nelson, OT dietitian. Dr. Davis recognized chaplain Doug Johnson for shared goals, mutual respect, timely communication. And the stories, you had to actually tell a story. You don't just post that. Dr. Yandel overheard nursing staff discussing a procedure a patient had. He took the time to find an anatomical picture and explain what took place. This was not even his patient or his service. He just took the time to offer his knowledge. So it gives a concrete example that people can say, oh, that's not so, I could do that. I could definitely do that. In making discharge recommendations, Jen needs as much information as possible about any changes in routines the patient will experience and new knowledge the patient must take in. Christy, as a dietitian, discussed the new knowledge and so on. Christy sharing her expertise helped Jen make a safe discharge recommendation. So it's getting at the interdependence. It's very simple. And finally, when a patient's in a code situation, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, other team members are focused on working with the patient. Fortunately, we have pastoral care to provide comfort and support to family members. Despite heroic efforts, the patient died. Chaplain Doug was present and supportive to the family. Moreover, he offered his compassionate support to the ICU staff, nurses, and MDs. So these are written up in the newsletter. And what kind of effect would that have, do you think? Maybe it makes people start to notice different things that they just maybe took for granted, and noticing it and saying, oh, I could do that. It could be like a positive contagion even. So that's one, and so they had the winners, of course, and it turned out it was almost a tie, so the therapist shared the pizza party with the nurses, and that's Jen Potts here, by the way, who's on the left, and I hear she was just appointed RC, coordinator or leader for the health system. This is a couple years later. But what they did right at the end of that was right around the holidays. What they did was develop a resolution. I resolved to share my goals of patient care with other team members, also learn about their patient care goals, and contribute to the development of shared goals. So you can look at this and say, well, this is hokey, this wouldn't work in our organization, but you could potentially, there's an underlying thought here that could be adapted. These almost are becoming new standards of behavior that we're now making explicit to each other and adopting them, with our own kind of resolve. I resolved to share my knowledge about patient care and also learn about their patient care responsibilities and draw on their expertise. I resolved to respect the work, experience, knowledge, and patient care goals. Also expect that same respect from them. That's a big statement, given what we know is often a very hierarchical setting in healthcare. And then finally, make sure all my communication solves problems. I will not place blame or complain. So that kind of orientation, let's find a solution here. And what I found was that that it wasn't just changing the relational dynamics, but they were also developing new structures to support RC. And one was, just to use the example of shared meetings, they had been very sporadic in doing patient-centered, family-centered rounds. But once they heard that from the fishbowl, it's like, well, we should all do that. And then started shadowing each other to see how they do it. They developed a protocol that helped them remember to ask different perspectives around because they'd gotten to the point where it was just the doctor talking and everyone listening, and which is probably why they stopped doing them. But when they remembered to say, and what are you thinking, Jen? What's going on from a respiratory standpoint? They became more dynamic and useful, and so on. They even brought in the people who developed the electronic health record, Cerner, to say, okay, we want to spend a day together. We have some specific things that we need to talk through that could be redesigned, we think, fairly easily to better support our coordination. So they're able to go back from now we have higher RC, and we can go back and redesign some of the structures to help support what we're now trying to do and we're better aware of. So the final one is Danish municipalities, and I'll just tell this story because it goes beyond any organization to a broader entity. And I think if we're talking about social determinants of health and really trying to go beyond fixing people when they're sick, we're getting to something more like this. And this this is an example of an organizational change that really is a broader set of actors. So they're responsible for a lot of things. The word Varde Municipality is Varde, actually Kommun, which means like a commonwealth. And they're accountable now for 20% of healthcare costs if a citizen has to go to the hospital or visits a doctor. So they have an incentive to keep people well. Say you had a stroke. We know it's better to have exercise. It's part of the change now that you take responsibility for your own health. And we as a municipality support that. You can't just go to the doctor and say, cure me. Instead, it's take responsibility for your life. And Kirsten Meyrup became critical in developing this new way of doing health and wellness in the community. We also do rehab for those who are out of work. If you lose your work, you lose your connections with work. Within 6 months, it's tough to get you back into work. It's our job to get them healthy and get them back to work again. This takes a lot of collaboration between different people. And now we have the challenge of working across sectors to do all these things, and we don't know how to do it yet. These people have to get along and work together. Sometimes it works, especially at the beginning of the week. And they all start cracking up. I'm like, is that a Danish joke? They need to have good relationship between each other and a good dialogue. They need to know what's going on in the other silos. Otherwise, nothing works. So they were on this journey, but they knew they were not good at it yet. They were still, everyone was in their silos. We also need to coordinate with the doctors and the hospitals. It's a real challenge for us. We have our own budgets, our own goals. We're not clear about our shared goals. We don't have enough knowledge of what each other does. So in this case, Karsten Hornstrup walked them through an exercise where the frontline leaders were kind of mapping out what they thought the current state of relational coordination was, and then they did an actual survey and found that I should have both. One where they did a map, they were just guessing, and then they actually measured it. And it was pretty similar, a little bit worse than they thought. And Karsten said what we did was discuss the map with the frontline leaders. We brainstormed how we could handle this thing, talking about role clarification, building spaces for cross-professional collaboration. But what I really loved is the CEO looked at this. I was there when the CEO was being shown as the mayor, et cetera, what were the results. And he said, after he asked a lot of questions about what is this map and the red ties we see here just reflect the way we've told our employees to work. We tell them you have to go work and do your job. We think we tell them to work together, but that's not what they're hearing from us. So he was basically looking at that, and I've seen other leaders who I would imagine they'd look at that and say, terrible employees, what are we going to do about these employees? We need new ones. But this one was saying, no, we are reinforcing this, and how can we do that differently? So I like that taking of responsibility. And they started looking for ways to support the changes, combining budgets between the hospital and the municipality, around certain citizens, developing new agreements, and so on. But what I came to conclude, and this is really getting to the end now, is that the kinds of interventions needed for sustainable change were not just the structural, but also the relational and changing the nature of the work itself. And that it takes us from this kind of linear model of structure, process, outcomes to say, no, these interventions can be more direct, and creating this space, doing the kind of assessment. There's a lot of appreciative inquiry that seems to be involved in the more effective cases where people are able to start improving those dynamics and then change the structures as needed to help support now what we know we're trying to do. It's not just kind of coming in from the outside, but helping to generate that creative capacity internally. And it does seem to, because this involves changes right there at the front line where you can change the thing yourself tomorrow. We can all agree to do family-centered rounds. We're going to, of course, it requires getting all these different parties to agree, but it doesn't require the CEO to do that. And then there are things that really do require higher level leadership. So it really is a multi-level model of change, but not all that complex. And so just to think about, what is a change path? Because there are different points of entry that may work well, and there's still, I think, so much to learn. And I'll just say I think one of the really interesting questions is, what is the role of measurement? Is that measuring and reflecting back these patterns? People say, you can look at these different ways of presenting it. Is that helpful? Is it not? Does it just reinforce this idea that everything's a report card? People say, well, it's like looking into the mirror. Or as our colleagues in Canada say, it's like putting the elephant or the moose on the table, where we can kind of see it now from different directions. We can all look at it together. Maybe it's like going up on the balcony and looking down and see, how are we doing? And make visible something that we know matters, but it's often not easy to get our arms around. And so I think there's still so much to learn here, and just want to thank you for your time, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions.
We promise. Oh, great.
You hadn't seen the cover design yet, had you?
Yeah, I haven't seen that. It's beautiful. So
it's probably
we have,
time. Oh my
we're
heavens.
out of time
Yes.
for the questions.
Yes.
But Jody's going to be here for at least another 20 minutes. We have food out here. You're welcome to join.